Tess of the d'Urbervilles by Thomas Hardy.
Chapter 24. Amid the oozing fatness and warm ferments of the Var Vale, at a season when the rush of juices could almost be heard below the hiss of fermentation, it was impossible that the most fanciful love should not grow passionate. The ready bosoms existing there were impregnated by their surroundings. June passed over their heads, and the Thermidorian weather which had come in its wake seemed an effort on the part of nature to match the state of hearts at Talbothays Dairy. The air of the place, so fresh in the spring and early summer, was stagnant and enervating now. Its heavy scents weighed upon them, and at midday the landscape seemed lying in a swoon. Ethiopic scorchings browned the upper slopes of the pastures, but there was still bright green herbage here where the watercourses purled. And as Clare was oppressed by the outward heats, so was he burdened inwardly by waxing fervour of passion for the soft and silent Tess. The rains having passed, the uplands were dry. The wheels of the dairyman's spring cart, as he sped home from market, licked up the pulverized surface of the highway, and were followed by white ribbons of dust, as if they had set a thin powder train on fire. The cows jumped wildly over the 5-barred Barton gate, maddened by the gadfly. Dairyman Crick kept his shirt-sleeves permanently rolled up from Monday to Saturday. Open windows had no effect on ventilation without open doors, and the dairy garden, the blackbirds and thrushes, crept out among the currant bushes, rather in the manner of quadrupeds than of winged creatures. The flies in the kitchen were lazy, teasing and familiar, crawling about in unwanted places, on the floor, into drawers, and over the backs of the milkmaids' hands. Conversations were concerning sunstroke, while butter-making and still more butter-making was a despair. They milked entirely in the meads for coolness and convenience, without driving in the cows. During the day the animals obsequiously followed the shadow of the smallest tree as it moved round the stem with the diurnal roll, and when the milkers came they could hardly stand still for the flies. On one of these afternoons 4 or 5 unmilked cows chanced to stand apart from the general herd, behind the corner of a hedge, among them being Dumpling and Old Pretty, who loved Tess's hands above those of any other maid. When she rose from her stool under a finished cow, Angel Clare, who had been observing her for some time, asked her if she would take the aforesaid creatures next. She silently assented, and with her stool at arm's length and the pail against her knee, went round to where they stood. Soon the sound of Old Pretty's milk fizzing into the pail came through the hedge, and then Angel felt inclined to go round the corner also, to finish off a hard-yielding milcher who had strayed there, he being now as capable of this as the dairyman himself. All the men, and some of the women, when milking, dug their foreheads into the cows and gazed into the pail, but a few, mainly the younger ones, rested their heads sideways. This was Tess Durbeyfield's habit, her temple pressing the milcher's flank, her eyes fixed on the far end of the meadow with the quiet of one lost in meditation. She was milking Old Pretty thus, and the sun chancing to be on the milking side, it shone flat against her pink-gowned form and her white curtained bonnet, and upon her profile, rendering it keen as a cameo cut from the dun background of the cow. She did not know that Clare had followed her round, and that he sat under his cow watching her. The stillness of her head and features was remarkable. She might have been in a trance, her eyes open, yet unseeing. Nothing in the picture moved but Old Pretty's tail and Tess's pink hands, the latter so gently as to be a rhythmic pulsation only, as if they were obeying a reflex stimulus, like a beating heart. How very lovable her face was to him! Yet there was nothing ethereal about it. All was real vitality, real warmth, real incarnation, and it was in her mouth that this culminated. Eyes almost as deep and speaking as he had seen before, and cheeks perhaps as fair, brows as arched, a chin and throat almost as shapely. Her mouth he had seen nothing to equal on the face of the earth. To a young man with the least fire in him, that little upward lift in the middle of her red top lip was distracting, infatuating, maddening. He had never before seen a woman's lips and teeth which forced upon his mind with such persistent iteration the old Elizabethan simile of roses filled with snow. Perfect, he, as a lover, might have called them offhand. But no, they were not perfect, and it was the touch of the imperfect upon the would-be perfect that gave the sweetness, because it was that which gave the humanity. Clare had studied the curves of those lips so many times that he could reproduce them mentally with ease, and now, as they again confronted him, clothed with colour and life, they sent an aura over his flesh, a breeze through his nerves, which well-nigh produced a qualm, and actually produced, by some mysterious physiological process, a prosaic sneeze. She then became conscious that he was observing her, but she would not show it by any change of position, though the curious dreamlike fixity disappeared, and a close eye might easily have discerned that the rosiness of her face deepened, and then faded till only a tinge of it was left. The influence that had passed into Clare like an excitation from the sky did not die down. Resolutions, reticences, prudences, fears fell back like a defeated battalion. He jumped up from his seat, and leaving his pail to be kicked over if the milcher had such a mind, went quickly toward the desire of his eyes, and kneeling down beside her, clasped her in his arms. Tess was taken completely by surprise, and she yielded to his embrace with unreflecting inevitableness. Having seen that it was really her lover who had advanced, and no one else, her lips parted, and she sank upon him in her momentary joy, with something like a very ecstatic cry. He had been on the point of kissing that too tempting mouth, but he had checked himself for tender conscience' sake. "Forgive me, Tess, dear," he whispered. "I ought to have asked. I did not know what I was doing. I do not mean it as a liberty. I am devoted to you, Tessie, dearest, in all sincerity." Old Pretty by this time had looked round, puzzled, and seeing two people crouching under her where, by immemorial custom, there should have been only one, lifted her hind leg crossly. "She's angry. She doesn't know what we mean. She'll kick over the milk," exclaimed Tess, gently striving to be free herself, her eyes concerned with the quadruped's action, her heart more deeply concerned with herself and Clare. She slipped up from her seat, and they stood together, his arm still encircling her. Tess's eyes, fixed on distance, began to fill. "Why do you cry, my darling?" he said. "Oh, I don't know," she murmured. As she saw and felt more clearly the position she was in, she became agitated and tried to withdraw. "Well, I have betrayed my feeling, Tess, at last," said he with a curious sigh of desperation, signifying unconsciously that his heart had outrun his judgment. "That I love you dearly, and truly I need not say. But it shall go no further now. It distresses you. I am surprised as you are. You will not think I have presumed upon your defencelessness, being too quick and unreflecting, will you?" I can't tell." He had allowed her to free herself, and in a minute or two the milking of each was resumed. Nobody had beheld the gravitation of the two into one, and when the dairyman came round by that screened nook a few minutes later, there was not a sign to reveal that the markedly sundered pair were more to each other than mere acquaintance. Yet in the interval since Crick's last view of them something had occurred which changed the pivot of the universe for their two natures, something which, had he known its quality, the dairyman would have despised as a practical man, yet which was based upon a more stubborn and restless tendency than a whole heap of so-called practicalities. A veil had been whisked aside. The tract of each one's outlook was to have a new horizon henceforward, for a short time or for a long. End of chapter 24. End of phase the third.
Tests of the d'Urbervilles by Thomas Hardy.
Phase the fourth. The consequence. Chapter 25. Clare, restless, went out into the dusk when evening drew on, she who had won him having retired to her chamber. The night was as sultry as the day. There was no coolness after dark unless on the grass. Roads, garden paths, the house fronts, the barton walls were warm as hearths, and reflected the noontide temperature into the noctambulist's face. He sat in the east gate of the dairy yard, and knew not what to think of himself. Feeling had indeed smothered judgment that day. Since the sudden embrace 3 hours before, the twain had kept apart. She seemed stilled, almost alarmed at what had occurred, while the novelty, unpremeditation, mastery of circumstance disquieted him. Palpitating, contemplated being that he was, he could hardly realize their true relations to each other as yet, and what their mutual bearing should be before third parties henceforward. Angel had come as pupil to this dairy in the idea that his temporary residence here was to be the merest episode in his life, soon passed through and easily forgotten. He had come as to a place from which, as to a screened alcove, he could calmly view the absorbing world without, and apostrophizing it with Walt Whitman, "Crowds of men and women, attired in the usual costumes, how curious you are to me," resolve upon a plan for plunging into that world anew. But behold, the absorbing scene had been imported hither. What had been the engrossing world had dissolved into an uninteresting outer dumb show, while here, in this apparently dim and impassioned place, novelty had volcanically started up, as it had never for him started up elsewhere. Every window of the house being open, Clare could hear across the yard each trivial sound of the retiring household. That dairy house, so humble, so insignificant, so purely to him a place of constrained sojourn, that he had never hitherto deemed it of sufficient importance to be reconnoitred as an object of any quality whatever in the landscape. What was it now? The aged and lichened brick gables breathed forth "Stay." The windows smiled, the door coaxed and beckoned, the creeper blushed confederacy. A personality within it was so far-reaching in her influence as to spread into and make the bricks, mortar, and whole overhanging sky throb with a burning sensibility. Whose was this mighty personality? A milkmaid's. It was amazing indeed to find how great a matter the life of the obscure dairy had become to him, and though new love was to be held partly responsible for this, it was not solely so. Many besides Angel have learned that the magnitude of lives is not as to their external displacements, but as to their subjective experiences. The impressionable peasant leads a larger, fuller, more dramatic life than the pachydermatous king. Looking at it thus, he found that life was to be seen of the same magnitude here as elsewhere. Despite his heterodoxy, faults and weaknesses, Clare was a man of conscience. Tess was no insignificant creature to toy with and dismiss, but a woman living her precious life, a life which, to herself who endured or enjoyed it, possessed as great a dimension as the life of the mightiest to himself. Upon her sensations the whole world depended to Tess. Through her existence all her fellow creatures existed to her. The universe itself only came into being for Tess on the particular day in the particular year in which she was born. This consciousness upon which he had intruded was the single opportunity of existence ever vouchsafed to Tess by an unsympathetic first cause, her all, her every and only chance. How then should he look upon her as of less consequence than himself, as a pretty trifle to caress and grow weary of, and not deal in the great seriousness with the affection which he knew that he had awakened in her, so fervid and so impressionable as she was under her reserve, in order that it might not agonize and wreck her? To encounter her daily in the accustomed manner would be to develop what had begun. Living in such close relations, to meet meant to fall into endearment. Flesh and blood could not resist it. And having arrived at no conclusion as to the issue of such a tendency, he decided to hold aloof, for the present, from occupations in which they would be mutually engaged. As yet the harm done was small. But it was not easy to carry out the resolution never to approach her. He was driven towards her by every heave of his pulse. He thought he would go and see his friends. It might be possible to sound them upon this. In less than 5 months his term here would have ended, and after a few additional months spent upon other farms he would be fully equipped in agricultural knowledge, and in a position to start on his own account. Would not a farmer want a wife? And should a farmer's wife be a drawing-room wax figure, or a woman who understood farming? Notwithstanding the pleasing answer returned to him by the silence, he resolved to go his journey. One morning, when they sat down at breakfast at Talbothays dairy, some maid observed that she had not seen anything of Mr. Clare that day. "Oh, no," said Dairyman Crick. "Mr. Clare has gone home to Emminster to spend a few days with his kinfolk." For 4 impassioned ones around that table the sunshine of the morning went out at a stroke, and the birds muffled their song. But neither girl by word or gesture revealed her blankness. "He's getting on towards the end of his time wi' me," added the dairyman, with a phlegm which unconsciously was brutal. "And so I suppose he is beginning to see about his plans elsewhere." "How much longer is he to bide here?" asked Izz Huett, the only one of the gloom-stricken bevy who could trust her voice with the question. The others waited for the dairyman's answer as if their lives hung upon it. Retty, with parted lips, gazing on the tablecloth; Marian, with heat added to her redness; Tess, throbbing, and looking out at the meads. "Well, I can't mind that exact day without looking at my memorandum book," replied Crick with the same intolerable unconcern. "And even that may be altered a bit. He'll bide to get a little practice in the carving out of the straw yard for certain. He'll hang on till the end of the year, I should say." 4 months or so of torturing ecstasy in his society, of pleasure girded about with pain. After that, the blackness of unutterable night. At this moment of the morning Angel Clare was riding along a narrow lane 10 miles distant from the breakfasters, in the direction of his father's vicarage at Emminster, carrying, as well as he could, a little basket which contained some black puddings and a bottle of mead sent by Mrs. Crick with her kind regards to his parents. The white lane stretched before him, and his eyes were upon it, but they were staring into the next year, and not at the lane. He loved her. Ought he to marry her? Dared he to marry her? What would his mother and brothers say? What would he himself say in a couple of years after the event? That would depend upon whether the germs of staunch comradeship underlay the temporary emotion, or whether it were a sensuous joy in her form only, with no substratum of everlastingness. His father's hill-surrounded little town, the Tudor church tower of red stone, the clump of trees near the vicarage, came at last into view beneath him, and he rode down towards the well-known gate. Casting a glance in the direction of the church before entering his home, he beheld, standing by the vestry door, a group of girls, ages between 12 and 16, apparently awaiting the arrival of some other one, who in a moment became visible. A figure somewhat older than the schoolgirls, wearing a broad-brimmed hat and highly starched cambric morning gown, with a couple of books in her hand. Clare knew her well. He could not be sure that she observed him. He hoped she did not, so as to render it unnecessary that he should go and speak to her, blameless creature that she was. An overpowering reluctance to greet her made him decide that she had not seen him. The young lady was Miss Mercy Chant, the only daughter of his father's neighbour and friend, whom it was his parents' quiet hope that he might wed some day. She was great at antinomianism and Bible classes, and was plainly going to hold a class now. Clare's mind flew to the impassioned, summer-steeped heathens of the Var Vale, their rosy faces court-patched with cow droppings, and to one, the most impassioned of them all. It was on the impulse of the moment that he had resolved to trot over to Emminster, and hence had not written to apprise his father and mother, aiming, however, to arrive about the breakfast hour, before they should have gone out to their parish duties. He was a little late, and they had already sat down to the morning meal. The group at table jumped up to welcome him as soon as he entered. They were his father and mother, his brother, the Reverend Felix, curate at a town in the adjoining county, home for the inside of a fortnight, and his other brother, the Reverend Cuthbert, the classical scholar, and fellow and dean of his college, down from Cambridge for the long vacation. His mother appeared in a cap and silver spectacles, and his father looked what in fact he was, an earnest, God-fearing man, somewhat gaunt, in years about 65, his pale face lined with thought and purpose. Over their heads hung the picture of Angel's sister, the eldest of the family, 16 years his senior, who had married a missionary and gone out to Africa. Old Mr. Clare was a clergyman of a type which, within the last 20 years, has well nigh dropped out of contemporary life. A spiritual descendant in the direct line from Wycliffe, Huss, Luther, Calvin, an evangelical of the evangelicals, a conversionist, a man of apostolic simplicity in life and thought, he had in his raw youth made up his mind once and for all on the deeper questions of existence, and admitted no further reasoning on them henceforward. He was regarded even by those of his own date and school of thinking as extreme, while on the other hand those totally opposed to him were unwillingly won to admiration for his thoroughness, and for the remarkable power he showed in dismissing all question as to principles in his energy for applying them. He loved Paul of Tarsus, liked St. John, hated St. James as much as he dared, and regarded with mixed feelings Timothy, Titus, and Philemon. The New Testament was less a Christiad than a Pauliad to his intelligence, less an argument than an intoxication. His creed of determinism was such that it almost amounted to a vice, and quite amounted, on its negative side, to a remunerative philosophy which had cousinship with that of Schopenhauer and Leopardi. He despised the canons and the rubric, swore by the articles, and deemed himself consistent through the whole category, which in a way he might have been. One thing he certainly was: sincere. To the aesthetic, sensuous, pagan pleasure in natural life and lush womanhood which his son Angel had lately been experiencing in Var Vale, his temper would have been quite antipathetic in a high degree, had he either by inquiry or imagination been able to apprehend it. Once upon a time Angel had been so unlucky as to say to his father in a moment of irritation that it might have resulted far better for mankind if Greece had been the source of the religion of modern civilization and not Palestine. And his father's grief was of that blank description which could not realize that there might lurk 1,000th part of a truth, much less a half-truth or a whole truth, in such a proposition. He had simply preached austerely at Angel for some time after. But the kindness of his heart was such that he never resented anything for long, and welcomed his son to-day with a smile which was as candidly sweet as a child's. Angel sat down, and the place felt like home. Yet he did not so much as formally feel himself one of the family gathered there. Every time that he returned hither he was conscious of this divergence, and since he had last shared in the vicarage life it had grown even more distinctly foreign to his own than usual. Its transcendental aspirations, still unconsciously based on the geocentric view of things, a zenithal paradise, a nadiral hell, were as foreign to his own as if they had been the dreams of people on another planet. Latterly he had seen only life, felt only the great passionate pulse of existence, unwarped, uncontorted, untrammelled by those creeds which futilely attempt to check what wisdom would be content to regulate. On their part they saw a great difference in him, a growing divergence from the Angel Clare of former times. It was chiefly a difference in his manner that they noticed just now, particularly his brother's. He was getting to behave like a farmer. He flung his legs about, the muscles of his face had grown more expressive, his eyes looked as much information as his tongue spoke, and more. The manner of the scholar had nearly disappeared, still more the manner of the drawing-room young man. A prig would have said that he had lost culture, and a prude that he had become coarse. Such was the contagion of domiciliary fellowship with the Talbothays nymphs and swains. After breakfast he walked with his two brothers, non-evangelical, well-educated, hall-marked young men, correct to their remotest fibre, such unimpeachable models as are turned out yearly by the lathe of a systematic tuition. They were both somewhat short-sighted, and when it was the custom to wear a single eyeglass and a string, they wore a single eyeglass and a string. When it was the custom to wear a double glass, they wore a double glass. When it was the custom to wear spectacles, they wore spectacles straightway, all without reference to the particular variety of defect in their own vision. When Wordsworth was enthroned, they carried pocket-copies, and when Shelley was belittled, they allowed him to grow dusty on their shelves. When Correggio's Holy Families were admired, they admired Correggio's Holy Families. When he was decried in favour of Velasquez, they sedulously followed suit without any personal objection. If these two noticed Angel's growing social ineptness, he noticed their growing mental limitations. Felix seemed to him all church, Cuthbert all college. His diocesan synod and visitations were the mainspring of the world to the one, Cambridge to the other. Each brother candidly recognized that there were a few unimportant scores of millions of outsiders in civilized society, persons who were neither university men nor churchmen, but they were to be tolerated rather than reckoned with and respected. They were both dutiful and attentive sons, and were regular in their visits to their parents. Felix, though an offshoot from a far more recent point in the devolution of theology than his father, was less self-sacrificing and disinterested. More tolerant than his father of a contradictory opinion, in its aspect as a danger to its holder, he was less ready than his father to pardon it as a slight to his own teaching. Cuthbert was, on the whole, the more liberal-minded, though with a greater subtlety. He had not so much heart. As they walked along the hillside, Angel's former feeling revived in him, that whatever their advantages by comparison with himself, neither saw nor set forth life as it really was lived. Perhaps, as with many men, their opportunities of observation were not so good as their opportunities of expression. Neither had an adequate conception of the complicated forces at work outside the smooth and gentle current in which they and their associates floated. Neither saw the difference between local truth and universal truth, that what the inner world said in their clerical and academic hearing was quite a different thing from what the outer world was thinking. "I suppose it is farming or nothing for you now, my dear fellow," Felix was saying among other things to his youngest brother, as he looked through his spectacles at the distant fields with sad austerity, "and therefore we must make the best of it. But I do entreat you to endeavour to keep as much as possible in touch with moral ideas. Farming, of course, means roughing it externally, but high thinking may go with plain living nevertheless." "Of course it may," said Angel. "Was it not proven 1900 years ago, if I may trespass upon your domain a little? Why should you think, Felix, that I am likely to drop my high thinking and my moral ideals?" "Well, I fancied from the tone of your letters and our conversation, it may be fancy only, that you were somehow losing intellectual grasp. Hasn't it struck you, Cuthbert?" "Now, Felix," said Angel dryly, "we are very good friends, you know, each of us treading our allotted circles, but if it comes to intellectual grasp, I think you, as a contented dogmatist, had better leave mine alone, and inquire what has become of yours." They returned down the hill to dinner, which was fixed at any time at which their father's and mother's morning work in the parish usually concluded. Convenience as regarded afternoon callers was the last thing to enter into the consideration of selfish Mr. and Mrs. Clare, though the three sons were sufficiently in unison on this matter to wish that their parents would conform a little to modern notions. The walk had made them hungry. Angel, in particular, who was now an outdoor man, accustomed to the profuse darpes inempte of the dairyman's somewhat coarsely laden table. But neither of the old people had arrived, and it was not till the sons were almost tired of waiting that their parents entered. The self-denying pair had been occupied in coaxing the appetites of some of their sick parishioners, whom they, somewhat inconsistently, tried to keep imprisoned in the flesh, their own appetites being quite forgotten. The family sat down to table, and a frugal meal of cold viands was deposited before them. Angel looked round for Mrs. Crick's black puddings, which he had directed to be nicely grilled, as they did them at the dairy, and of which he wished his father and mother to appreciate the marvellous herbal savours as highly as he did himself. "Ah, you are looking for the black puddings, my dear boy," observed Clare's mother, "but I am sure you will not mind doing without them, as I am sure your father and I shall not, when you know the reason. I suggested to him that we should take Mrs. Crick's kind present to the children of the man who can earn nothing just now because of his tax of delirium tremens, and he agreed that it would be a great pleasure to them, so we did." "Of course," said Angel cheerfully, looking round for the mead. "I found the mead so extremely alcoholic," continued his mother, "that it was quite unfit for use as a beverage, but as valuable as rum or brandy in an emergency, so I have put it in my medicine chest." "We never drink spirits at this table on principle," added his father. "But what shall I tell the dairyman's wife?" said Angel. "The truth, of course," said his father. "I rather wanted to say we had enjoyed the mead and the black puddings very much. She is a kind, jolly sort of body, and is sure to ask me directly I return." "You cannot if we did not," Mr. Clare answered lucidly. "Ah, no, though that mead was a drop of pretty tipple." "A what?" said Cuthbert and Felix both. "Oh, 'tis an expression they use down at Talbothays," replied Angel, blushing. He felt that his parents were right in their practice, if wrong in their want of sentiment, and said no more. Chapter 25.
Tests of the d'Urbervilles by Thomas Hardy.
Chapter 26. It was not until the evening, after family prayers, that Angel found opportunity of broaching to his father one or two subjects near his heart. He had strung himself up to the purpose while kneeling behind his brothers on the carpet, studying the little nails in the heels of their walking boots. When the service was over they went out of the room with their mother, and Mr. Clare and himself were left alone. The young man first discussed with the elder his plans for the attainment of his position as a farmer on an extensive scale, either in England or in the colonies. His father then told him that, as he had not been put to the expense of sending Angel up to Cambridge, he had felt it his duty to set by a sum of money every year towards the purchase or lease of land for him some day, that he might not feel himself unduly slighted. "As far as worldly wealth goes," continued his father, "you will no doubt stand far superior to your brothers in a few years." This considerateness on old Mr Clare's part led Angel onward to the other and dearer subject. He observed to his father that he was then 26, and that when he would start in the farming business he would require eyes in the back of his head to see to all matters. Someone would be necessary to superintend the domestic labours of his establishment whilst he was afield. Would it not be well, therefore, for him to marry? His father seemed to think this idea not unreasonable, and then Angel put the question. "What kind of wife do you think would be best for me as a thrifty, hard-working farmer?" "A truly Christian woman, who would be of help and a comfort to you in your goings out and your comings in. Beyond that it really matters little. Such a one can be found. Indeed, my earnest-minded friend and neighbour, Dr. Chance—" "But ought she not primarily be able to milk cows, churn good butter, make immense cheeses, know how to sit hens and turkeys and rear chickens, to direct a field of labourers in an emergency, and estimate the value of sheep and calves?" "Yes, a farmer's wife, yes, certainly, it would be desirable." Mr Clare the elder had plainly never thought of these points before. "I was going to add," he said, "that for a pure and saintly woman you will not find one more to your true advantage, and certainly not more to your mother's mind and my own, than your friend Mercy, whom you used to show a certain interest in. It is true that my neighbour Chant's daughter has lately caught up the fashion of the younger clergy round about us for decorating the communion table, altar, as I was shocked to hear her call it one day, with flowers and other stuff on festival occasions. But her father, who is quite as opposed to such flummery as I, said that it can be cured. It is a mere girlish outbreak, which I am sure will not be permanent." Yes, Mercy is good and devout, I know, but, father, don't you think that a young woman equally pure and virtuous as Miss Chant, but one who, in place of that lady's ecclesiastical accomplishments, understands the duties of farm life as well as a farmer himself, would suit me infinitely better?" His father persisted in his conviction that a knowledge of a farmer's wife's duties came second to a Pauline view of humanity, and the impulsive Angel, wishing to honour his father's feelings and to advance the cause of his heart at the same time, grew specious. He said that fate or Providence had thrown in his way a woman who possessed every qualification to be the helpmate of an agriculturalist, and was decidedly of a serious turn of mind. He would not say whether or not she had attached herself to the sound Low Church school of his father, but she would probably be open to conviction on that point. She was a regular church-goer of simple faith, honest-hearted, receptive, intelligent, graceful to a degree, chaste as a vestal, and in personal appearance exceptionally beautiful. "Is she of a family such that you would care to marry into, a lady, in short?" asked his startled mother, who had come softly into the study during the conversation. "She is not what in common parlance is called a lady," said Angel unflinchingly, "for she is a cottager's daughter, as I am proud to say. But she is a lady nevertheless, in feeling and nature." "Mercy Chant is of a very good family." "Pooh! "What's the advantage of that, mother?" said Angel quickly. "How is family to avail the wife of a man who has to rough it as I have, and shall have to do?" "Mercy is accomplished, and accomplishments have their charm," returned his mother, looking at him through her silver spectacles. "As to external accomplishments, what will be the use in them in the life I am going to lead? While as to her reading, I can take that in hand. She'll be apt pupil enough, as you would say if you knew her. She's brimful of poetry, actualized poetry, if I may use the expression. She lives what paper poets only write, and she's an unimpeachable Christian, I'm sure, perhaps of the very tribe, genus, and species you desire to propagate." "Oh, Angel, you are mocking." "Mother, I beg pardon. But as she really does attend church almost every Sunday morning, and is a good Christian girl, I'm sure you will tolerate any social shortcomings for the sake of that quality, and feel that I may do worse than choose her." Angel waxed quite earnest in that rather automatic orthodoxy in his beloved Tess, which, never dreaming that it might stand him in such good stead, he had been prone to slight when observing it practised by her and the other milkmaids, because of its obvious unreality amid beliefs essentially naturalistic. In their sad doubts as to whether their son had himself any right whatsoever to the title he claimed for the unknown young woman, Mr. and Mrs. Clare began to feel it as an advantage not to be overlooked that she at least was sound in her views, especially as the conjunction of the pair must have risen by an act of Providence, for Angel would never have made orthodoxy a condition of his choice. They said finally that it was better not to act in a hurry, but that they would not object to see her. Angel therefore refrained from declaring more particulars now. He felt that, single-minded and self-sacrificing as his parents were, there yet existed certain latent prejudices of theirs as middle-class people which would require some tact to overcome. For though legally at liberty to do as he chose, and though their daughter-in-law's qualifications could make no practical difference in their lives, in the probability of her living far away from them, he wished, for affection's sake, not to wound their sentiment in the most important decision of his life. He observed his own inconsistencies in dwelling upon accidents in Tess's life, as if they were vital features. It was for herself that he loved Tess, her soul, her heart, her substance, not for her skill in the dairy, her aptness as his scholar, and certainly not for her simple, formal faith professions. Her unsophisticated, open-air existence required no varnish of conventionality to make it palatable to him. He held that education had as yet but little affected the beats of emotion and impulse on which domestic happiness depends. It was probable that, in the lapse of ages, improved systems of moral and intellectual training would appreciably, perhaps considerably, elevate the involuntary and even the unconscious instincts of human nature, but up to the present-day culture, as far as he could see, might be said to have affected only the mental epiderm of those lives which had been brought under its influence. This belief was confirmed by his experience of women, which, having latterly been extended from the cultivated middle class into the rural community, had taught him how much less was the intrinsic difference between the good and wise woman of one social stratum and the good and wise woman of another social stratum, than between the good and bad, the wise and the foolish, of the same stratum or class. It was the morning of his departure. His brothers had already left the vicarage to proceed on a walking tour in the north, whence one was to return to his college and the other to his curacy. Angel might have accompanied them, but preferred to rejoin his sweetheart at Talbothays. He would have been an awkward member of the party, for though the most appreciative humanist, the most ideal religionist, even the best versed Christologist of the three, there was alienation in the standing consciousness that his squareness would not fit the round hole that had been prepared for him. To neither Felix nor Cuthbert had he ventured to mention Tess. His mother made him sandwiches, and his father accompanied him on his own mare a little way along the road. Having fairly well advanced his own affairs, Angel listened in a willing silence as they jogged on together through the shady lanes to his father's account of his parish difficulties and the coldness of brother clergymen whom he loved, because of his strict interpretations of the New Testament by the light of what they deemed a pernicious Calvinistic doctrine. "Pernicious!" said Mr. Clare with genial scorn, and he proceeded to recount experiences which would show the absurdity of that idea. He told of wondrous conversions of evil livers, of which he had been the instrument, not only amongst the poor, but amongst the rich and well-to-do, and he also candidly admitted many failures. As an instance of the latter, he mentioned the case of a young upstart squire named d'Urberville, living some 40 miles off, in the neighbourhood of Trantridge. "Not one of the ancient d'Urbervilles of Kingsbere and other places?" asked his son. "That curiously historic worn-out family with its ghostly legend of the coach and four?" "Oh, no. The original d'Urbervilles decayed and disappeared 60 or 80 years ago, at least, I believe so. This seems to be a new family which has taken the name. For the credit of the former knightly line, I hope they are spurious, I'm sure. But it is odd to hear you express interest in old families. I thought you set less store by them even than I." "You misapprehend me, father. You often do," said Angel with a little impatience. "Politically, I am sceptical as to the virtue of their being old. Some of the wise, even among themselves, acclaim against their own succession, as Hamlet puts it, but lyrically, dramatically, and even historically, I am tenderly attached to them." This distinction, though by no means a subtle one, was yet too subtle for Mr. Clare the elder, and he went on with the story he had been about to relate, which was that, after the death of the senior so-called d'Urberville, the young man developed the most culpable passions, though he had a blind mother whose condition should have made him know better. A knowledge of his career having come to the ears of Mr. Clare when he was in that part of the country preaching missionary sermons, he boldly took occasion to speak to the delinquent on his spiritual state. Though he was a stranger, occupying another's pulpit, he had felt this to be his duty, and took for his text the words from St. Luke, "Thou fool, this night thy soul shall be required of thee." The young man much resented this directness of attack, and in the war of words which followed, when they met, he did not scruple publicly to insult Mr. Clare without respect for his grey hairs. Angel flushed with distress. "Dear father," he said sadly, "I wish you would not expose yourself to such gratuitous pain from scoundrels." "Pain?" said his father, his rugged face shining in the ardour of self-abnegation. "The only pain to me was pain on his account. Poor foolish young man! Do you suppose his incensed words could give me any pain, or even his blows? Be reviled we bless, being persecuted we suffer it, being defamed we entreat. We are made as the filth of the world, and as the offscouring of all things unto this day. Those ancient and noble words of the Corinthians are strictly true at this present hour." "Not blows, father? He did not proceed to blows?" "No, he did not, though I have borne blows from men in a mad state of intoxication." "No." "A dozen times, my boy. What then? I have saved them from the guilt of murdering their own flesh and blood thereby, and they have lived to thank me and praise God." "May this young man do the same," said Angel fervently. "But I fear otherwise, from what you say." "We'll hope nevertheless," said Mr. Clare, "and I continue to pray for him, though on this side of the grave we shall probably never meet again. But after all, one of those poor words of mine may spring up in his heart as a good seed some day." Now, as always, Clare's father was sanguine as a child, and, though the younger could not accept his parents' narrow dogma, he revered his practice, and recognized the hero under the pietist. Perhaps he revered his father's practice even more now than ever, seeing that, in the question of making Tessie his wife, his father had not once thought of inquiring whether she were well provided or penniless. The same unworldliness was what had necessitated Angel's getting a living as a farmer, and would probably keep his brothers in the position of poor parsons for the term of their activities. Yet Angel admired it none the less. Indeed, despite his own heterodoxy, Angel often felt that he was nearer to his father on the human side than was either of his brethren. End of chapter 26.
Tess of the d'Urbervilles by Thomas Hardy.
Chapter 27. An uphill and downdale ride of 20-odd miles through a garish midday atmosphere brought him in the afternoon to a detached knoll a mile or two west of Talbothays, whence he again looked into that green trough of sappiness and humidity, the vale of the Var or Froom. Immediately he began to descend from the upland to the fat alluvial soil below, the atmosphere grew heavier. The languid perfume of the summer fruits, the mists, the hay, the flowers, formed therein a vast pool of odour, which at this hour seemed to make the animals, the very bees and butterflies, drowsy. Clare was now so familiar with the spot that he knew the individual cows by their names, when, a long distance off, he saw them dotted about the meads. It was with a sense of luxury that he recognized his power of viewing life here from its inner side, in a way that had been quite forgotten to him in his student days, and much as he loved his parents, he could not help being aware that to come here as now, after an experience of home life, affected him like throwing off splints and bandages, even the one customary curb on the humours of English rural society being absent in this place, Talbothays having no resident landlord. The denizens were all enjoying the usual afternoon nap of an hour or so, which the exceedingly early hours kept in summer-time rendered a necessity. At the door the wood-hooped pails, sodden and bleached by infinite scrubbings, hung like hats on a stand upon the forked and peeled limb of an oak fixed there for that purpose, all of them ready and dry for the evening milking. Angel entered and went through the silent passages of the house to the back quarters, where he listened for a moment. Sustained snores came from the cart-house, where some of the men were lying down. The grunt and squeal of sweltering pigs arose from the still further distance. The large-leaved rhubarb and cabbage plants slept too, their broad limp surfaces hanging in the sun like half-closed umbrellas. He unbridled and fed his horse, and as he re-entered the house the clock struck 3. 3 was the afternoon skimming hour, and with the stroke Clare heard the creaking of the floorboards above, and then the touch of a descending foot on the stairs. It was Tess's, who in another moment came down before his eyes. She had not heard him enter, and hardly realized his presence there. She was yawning, and he saw the red interior of her mouth as if it had been a snake's. She had stretched one arm so high above her coiled-up cable of hair that he could see its satin delicacy above the auburn. Her face was flushed with sleep, and her eyelids hung heavy over their pupils. The brim fullness of her nature breathed from her. It was a moment when a woman's soul is more incarnate than at any other time, when the most spiritual beauty bespeaks itself flesh, and sex takes the outside place in the presentation. Then those eyes flashed brightly through their filmy heaviness, before the remainder of her face was well awake. With an oddly compounded look of gladness, shyness, and surprise, she exclaimed, "Oh, Mr. Clare, how you frightened me! There had not at first been time for her to think of the changed relations which his declaration had introduced, but the full sense of the matter rose up in her face when she encountered Clare's tender look as he stepped forward to the bottom stair. "Dear darling Tessie," he whispered, putting his arm round her, and his face to her flushed cheek. "Don't, for heaven's sake, mister me any more. I've hastened back so soon because of you." Tess's excitable heart beat against his by way of reply, and there they stood upon the red brick floor of the entry, the sun slanting in by the window upon his back, as he held her tightly to his breast. Upon her inclining face, upon the blue veins of her temple, upon her naked arm and her neck, and into the depths of her hair. Having been lying down in her clothes, she was warm as a sunned cat. At first she would not look straight up at him, but her eyes soon lifted, and his plumbed the deepness of the ever-varying pupils, with their radiating fibrils of blue and black and grey and violet, while she regarded him as Eve at her second wakening might have regarded Adam. "I've got to go a-skimming," she pleaded, "and I've only old Deb to help me to-day. Mrs. Crick is gone to market with Mr. Crick, and Retty is not well, and the others are gone out somewhere, and won't be home till milking." As they retreated to the milk-house, Deborah Fyander appeared on the stairs. "I've come back, Deborah," said Mr. Clare upwards, "so I can help Tess with the skimming, and as you're very tired, I am sure, you needn't come down till milking time." Possibly Talbothays milk was not very thoroughly skimmed that afternoon. Tess was in a dream, wherein familiar objects appeared as having light and shade and position, but no particular outline. Every time she held the skimmer under the pump to cool it for the work, her hand trembled, the ardour of his affection being so palpable that she seemed to flinch under it like a plant in too burning a sun. Then he pressed her again to his side, and when she had done running her forefinger round the leads to cut off the cream edge, he cleaned it in nature's way, for the unconstrained manners of Talbothays Dairy came convenient now. "I may as well say it now as later, dearest," he resumed gently. "I wish to ask you something of a very practical nature, which I have been thinking of ever since that day last week in the meads. I shall soon want to marry, and being a farmer, you see, I shall require for my wife a woman who knows all about the management of farms. Will you be that woman, Tessie?" He put it in that way that she might not think he had yielded to an impulse of which his head would disapprove. She turned quite careworn. She had bowed to the inevitable result of proximity, the necessity of loving him, but she had not calculated upon this sudden corollary, which, indeed, Clare had put before her without quite meaning himself to do it so soon. With pain that was like the bitterness of dissolution, she murmured the words of her indispensable and sworn answer as an honourable woman. "Oh, Mr. Clare, I cannot be your wife. I cannot be." The sound of her own decision seemed to break Tess's very heart, and she bowed her face in her grief. "But Tess," he said, amazed at her reply, and holding her still more greedily close, "do you say no? Surely you love me." "Oh, yes, yes, and I would rather be yours than anybody's in the world," returned the sweet and honest voice of the distressed girl. "But I cannot marry you." "Tess," he said, holding her at arm's length, "you are engaged to marry someone else." "No, no." "Then why do you refuse me?" "I don't want to marry. I have not thought of doing it. I cannot. I only want to love you." "But why?" Driven to subterfuge, she stammered, Your father is a parson, and your mother wouldn't like you to marry such as me. She will want you to marry a lady." "Nonsense. I've spoken to them both. That is partly why I went home." "I feel I cannot. Never, never," she echoed. "Is it too sudden to be asked thus, my pretty?" "Yes. I did not expect it." "If you will let it pass, please, Tessie, I will give you time," he said. "It was very abrupt to come home and speak to you all at once. I'll not allude to it again for a while." She again took up the shining skimmer, held it beneath the pump, and began anew. But she could not, as at other times, hit the exact undersurface of the cream with the delicate dexterity required, try as she might. Sometimes she was cutting down into the milk, sometimes in the air. She could hardly see, her eyes having filled with two blurring tears drawn forth by a grief which, to this her best friend and dear advocate, she could never explain. "I can't skim, I can't," she said, turning away from him. Not to agitate and hinder her longer, the considerate Clare began talking in a more general way. "You quite misapprehend my parents. They are the most simple-mannered people alive, and quite unambitious. They are two of the few remaining evangelical school. Tessie, are you an evangelical?" "I don't know." "You go to church very regularly, and our parson here is not very high, they tell me." Tessie's ideas on the view of the parish clergyman, whom she heard every week, seemed to be rather more vague than Clare's, who had never heard him at all. "I wish I could fix my mind on what I hear there more firmly than I do," she remarked as a safe generality. "It is often a great sorrow to me." She spoke so unaffectedly that Angel was sure in his heart that his father could not object to her on religious grounds, even though she did not know whether her principles were high, low, or broad. He himself knew that in reality the confused beliefs which she held, apparently imbibed in childhood, were, if anything, Tractarian as to phraseology, and pantheistic as to essence. Confused or otherwise, to disturb them was his last desire. "Leave thou thy sister when she prays, her early heaven, her happy views, nor thou with shadowed hint confuse a life that leads melodious days." He had occasionally thought the counsel less honest than musical, but he gladly conformed to it now. He spoke further of the incidents of his visit, of his father's mode of life, of his zeal for his principles. She grew serener, and the undulations disappeared from her skimming. As she finished one lead after another, he followed her and drew the plugs for letting down the milk. "I fancied you looked a little downcast when you came in," she ventured to observe, anxious to keep away from the subject of herself. "Yes, well, my father has been talking a good deal to me of his troubles and difficulties, and the subject always tends to depress me. He is so zealous that he gets many snubs and buffetings from people in a different way of thinking from himself, and I don't like to hear of such humiliations to a man of his age, the more particularly as I don't think earnestness does any good when carried so far. He has been telling me of a very unpleasant scene in which he took part quite recently. He went as the deputy to some missionary society to preach in the neighbourhood of Trantridge, a place 40 miles from here, and made it his business to expostulate with a lax young cynic he met with somewhere about there, son of some landowner up that way, and who has a mother afflicted with blindness. My father addressed himself to the gentleman point blank, and there was quite a disturbance. It was very foolish of my father, I must say, to intrude his conversation upon a stranger when the probabilities were so obvious that it would be useless. But whatever he thinks to be his duty, that he'll do, in season or out of season. And of course he makes many enemies, not only among the absolutely vicious, but among the easy-going, who hate to be bothered. He says he glories in what happened, and that good may be done indirectly. but I wish he would not so wear himself out now he's getting old, and would leave such pigs to their wallowing." Tess's look had grown hard and worn, and her ripe mouth tragical, and she no longer showed any tremulousness. Clare's revived thoughts of his father prevented his noticing her particularly, and so they went on down the white row of liquid rectangles till they had finished and drained them off, when the other maids returned and took their pails, and Deb came to scald out the leads for the new milk. As Tess withdrew to go afield to the cows, he said to her softly, "And my question, Tessie?" "Oh, no, no," replied she, with grave hopelessness, as one who had heard anew the turmoil of her own past in the illusion of Alec d'Urberville. "It can't be." She went out toward the mead, joining the other milkmaids with a bound, as if to try to make the open air drive away her sad constraint. All the girls drew onward to the spot where the cows were grazing in the further mead, the bevy advancing with the bold grace of wild animals, the reckless, unchastened motion of women accustomed to unlimited space, in which they abandoned themselves to the air as a swimmer to the wave. It seemed natural enough to him now that Tess was again in sight to choose a mate from unconstrained nature, and not from the abodes of art. End of chapter 27.
Tess of the d'Urbervilles by Thomas Hardy.
Chapter 28. Her refusal, though unexpected, did not permanently daunt Clare. His experience of women was great enough for him to be aware that the negative often meant nothing more than the preface to the affirmative, and it was little enough for him not to know that in the manner of the present negative there lay a great exception to the dallyings of coyness. That she had already permitted him to make love to her he read as an additional assurance, not fully trowing that in the fields and pastures to sigh gratis is by no means deemed waste, love-making being here more often accepted inconsiderately and for its own sweet sake than in the carking, anxious homes of the ambitious, where a girl's craving for an establishment paralyses her healthy thought of a passion. "Tess, why did you say no in such a positive way?" he asked her in the course of a few days. She started. "Don't ask me. I told you why, partly. I'm not good enough, not worthy enough." "How? Not fine lady enough?" "Yes, something like that," murmured she. "Your friends would scorn me." "Indeed you mistake them, my father and mother. As for my brothers, I don't care." He clasped his fingers behind her back to keep her from slipping away. "Now, you did not mean it, sweet. I am sure you did not. You have made me so restless that I cannot read or play or do anything. I am in no hurry, Tess. But I want to know, to hear from your own warm lips, that you will some day be mine. Any time you may choose, but some day." She could only shake her head and look away from him. Clare regarded her attentively, conned the characters of her face as if they had been hieroglyphics. The denial seemed real. "Then I ought not to hold you in this way, ought I? I have no right to you, no right to seek out where you are, or to walk with you. Honestly, Tess, do you love any other man?" "How can you ask?" she said, with continued self-suppression. "I almost know that you do not, but then why do you repulse me?" "I don't repulse you. I like you to tell me you love me, and you may always tell me so as you go about with me, and never offend me." "But why will you not accept me as a husband?" "Ah, that's different. It is for your own good indeed, my dearest. Oh, believe me, it is only for your sake. I don't like to give myself the great happiness of promising to be yours in that way, because I'm sure I ought not to do it." "But you will make me happy." "Ah, you think so, but you don't know." In such times as this, apprehending the grounds of her refusal to be her modest sense of incompetence in matters social and polite, he would say that she was wonderfully well informed and versatile, which was certainly true, her natural quickness and her admiration for him having led her to pick up his vocabulary, his accent, and fragments of his knowledge to a surprising extent. After these contests and her victory, she would go away by herself under the remotest cow if at milking time, or into the sedge, or into her room if at leisure interval, and mourn silently, not a minute after an apparently phlegmatic negative. The struggle was so fearful, her own heart was so strongly on the side of his, two ardent hearts against one poor little conscience, that she tried to fortify her resolution by every means in her power. She had come to Talbothays with a made-up mind. On no account could she agree to a step which might afterwards cause bitter ruing to her husband for his blindness in wedding her, and she held that what her conscience had decided for her when her mind was unbiassed ought not to be overruled now. "Why don't someone tell him all about me?" she said. "It was only 40 miles off. Why hasn't it reached here? Somebody must know." Yet nobody seemed to know. Nobody told him. For 2 or 3 days no more was said. She guessed from the sad countenances of her chamber companions that they regarded her not only as the favourite, but as the chosen. But they could see for themselves that she did not put herself in his way. Tess had never before known a time in which the thread of her life was so distinctly twisted of 2 strands, positive pleasure and positive pain. At the next cheese-making the pair were again left alone together. The dairyman himself had been lending a hand, but Mr. Crick, as well as his wife, seemed latterly to have acquired a suspicion of mutual interest between these two, though they walked so circumspectly that suspicion was but of the faintest. Anyhow, the dairyman left them to themselves. They were breaking up the masses of curds before putting them into the vats. The operation resembled the act of crumbling bread on a large scale, and amid the immaculate whiteness of the curds Tess Durbeyfield's hands showed themselves of the pinkness of the rose. Angel, who was filling the vats with his handfuls, suddenly ceased and laid his hands flat upon hers. Her sleeves were rolled far above the elbow, and bending lower he kissed the inside vein of her soft arm. Although the early September weather was sultry, her arm, from her dabbling in the curds, was as cold and damp to his mouth as a new-gathered mushroom, and tasted of the whey. But she was such a sheaf of susceptibilities that her pulse was accelerated by the touch, her blood driven to her finger ends, and the cool arms flushed hot. Then, as though her heart had said, "Is coyness longer necessary? Truth is truth between man and woman, as between man and man." She lifted her eyes, and they beamed devotedly into his as her lip rose in a tender half-smile. "Do you know why I did that, Tess?" he said. "Because you love me very much." "Yes, and as a preliminary to a new entreaty." "Not again?" She looked a sudden fear that her resistance might break down under her own desire. "Oh, Tessie," he went on, "I cannot think why you are so tantalizing. Why do you disappoint me so? You seem almost like a coquette, upon my life you do, a coquette of the first urban water. They blow hot and blow cold, just as you do, and it is the very last sort of thing to expect to find in a retreat like Talbothays. And yet, dearest," he quickly added, observing how the remark had cut her, "I know you to be the most honest, spotless creature that ever lived. so how can I suppose you a flirt? Tess, why don't you like the idea of being my wife, if you love me as you seem to do? I have never said I don't like the idea, and I never could say it, because it isn't true." The stress now getting beyond endurance, her lip quivered, and she was obliged to go away. Clare was so pained and perplexed that he ran after and caught her in the passage. "Tell me, he said, passionately clasping her in forgetfulness of his curdy hands. "Do tell me that you won't belong to any one but me." I will tell you," she exclaimed, "and I will give you a complete answer, if you will let go now. I will tell you my experiences, all about myself, all." "Your experiences, dear, yes, certainly, any number." He expressed assent in loving satire, looking into her face. "My Tess has, no doubt, almost as many experiences as that wild convolvulus out there on the garden hedge that opened itself this morning for the first time. Tell me anything, but don't use that wretched expression any more about not being worthy of me." "I will try not, and I'll give you my reasons tomorrow, next week." "Say on Sunday?" "Yes, on Sunday." At last she got away, and did not stop in her retreat till she was in the thicket of pollard willows at the lower side of the barton, where she could be quite unseen. Here Tess flung herself down upon the rustling undergrowth of spear-grass as upon a bed, and remained crouching in palpitating misery, broken by momentary shoots of joy, which her fears about the ending could not altogether suppress. In reality she was drifting into acquiescence. Every seesaw of her breath, every wave of her blood, every pulse singing in her ears, was a voice that joined with nature in revolt against her scrupulousness. Reckless, inconsiderate acceptance of him, to close with him at the altar, revealing nothing and chancing discovery, to snatch ripe pleasure before the iron teeth of pain could have time to shut upon her. That was what love counselled. And in almost a terror of ecstasy Tess divined that, despite her many months of lonely self-chastisement, wrestlings, communings, schemes to lead a future of austere isolation, love's counsel would prevail. The afternoon advanced, and still she remained among the willows. She heard the rattle of taking down the pails from the forked stands, the wah-wah which accompanied the getting together of the cows, but she did not go to the milking. They would see her agitation, and the dairyman, thinking the cause to be love alone, would good-naturedly tease her, and that harassment could not be borne. Her lover must have guessed her overwrought state, and invented some excuse for her non-appearance, for no inquiries were made, or calls given. At 6:30 the sun settled down upon the levels, with the aspect of a great forge in the heavens, and presently a monstrous, pumpkin-like moon arose on the other hand. The pollard willows, tortured out of their natural shape by incessant choppings, became spiny-head monsters as they stood up against it. She went in and upstairs without a light. It was now Wednesday. Thursday came, and Angel looked thoughtfully at her from a distance, but intruded in no way upon her. The indoor milkmaids, Marian and the rest, seemed to guess that something definite was afoot, for they did not force any remarks upon her in the bedchamber. Friday passed. Saturday. Tomorrow was the day. "I shall give way. I shall say yes. I shall let myself marry him. I cannot help it," she jealously panted with her hot face in the pillow that night, on hearing one of the other girls sigh his name in her sleep. "I cannot bear to let anybody have him but me. Yes, it is a wrong to him, and may kill him when he knows. Oh, my heart! Oh, oh, oh!" End of chapter 28.
Tess of the d'Urbervilles by Thomas Hardy.
Chapter 29. "Now, who mid ye think I've heard news o' this morning?" said Dairyman Crick, as he sat down to breakfast next day, with a riddling gaze round the munching men and maids. "Now, just who mid ye think?" One guessed, and another guessed. Mrs. Crick did not guess, because she knew already. "Well," said the dairyman, "'tis that slack-twisted Orr's bird of a feller Jack Dollop. He's lately got married to a widow woman." "Not Jack Dollop? A villain to think of that," said a milker. The name entered quickly into Tess Durbeyfield's consciousness, for it was the name of the lover who had wronged his sweetheart, and had afterwards been so roughly used by the young woman's mother in the butter churn. "And has he married the valiant matron's daughter, as he promised?" asked Angel Clare absently, as he turned over the newspaper he was reading at the little table, to which he was always banished by Mrs. Crick in her sense of his gentility. "Not he, sir. Never meant to," replied the dairyman. "As I say, 'tis a widow woman, and she had money, it seems, £50 a year or so, and that was all he was after. They were married in a great hurry, and then she told him that by marrying she had lost her £50 a year. Just fancy the state of my gentleman's mind at the news. Never such a cat and dog life as they've been leading ever since. Serves him well, be right, but unlucky the poor woman gets the worst on't." "Well, the silly body should have told him sooner that the ghost of her first man would trouble him," said Mrs. Crick. "Ay, ay," responded the dairyman indecisively. "Still, you can see exactly how 'twas. She wanted a home, and didn't like to run the risk of losing him. Don't ye think that was something like it, maidens?" He glanced toward the row of girls. "She ought to told him just before they went out to church, when he could hardly have backed out," exclaimed Marian. "Yes, she ought," agreed Izz. "She must have seen what he was after, and should have refused him," said Retty spasmodically. "And what do you say, my dear?" asked the dairyman of Tess. "I think she ought to have told him the true state of things, or else refused him. I don't know," replied Tess, the bread and butter choking her. "Be cussed if I'd done either on't," said Beck Nibbs, a married helper from one of the cottages. "All's fair in love and war. I'd have married en just as she did, and if he'd have said 2 words to me about not telling him beforehand anything whatsomever about my first chap that I hadn't choose to tell, I'd have knocked him down wi' a rolling pin, a scram little fellow like he. Any woman could do it." The laughter which followed this sally was supplemented only by a sorry smile, for form's sake, from Tess. What was comedy to them was tragedy to her, and she could hardly bear the mirth. She soon rose from table, and, with an impression that Clare would follow her, went along a little wriggling path, now stepping to one side of the irrigating channels, and now to the other, till she stood by the main stream of the Var. Men had been cutting the water weeds higher up the river, and masses of them were floating past her, moving islands of green crowfoot, whereupon she might almost have ridden. Long locks of which weed had lodged against the piles driven to keep the cows from crossing. Yes, there was the pain of it, this question of a woman telling her story. The heaviest of crosses to herself seemed but amusement to others. It was as if people should laugh at martyrdom. "Tessie!" came from behind her, and Clare sprang across the gully, alighting beside her feet. "My wife soon?" "No, no, I cannot. For your sake, oh, Mr. Clare, for your sake I say no." "Tess!" "Still I say no," she repeated. Not expecting this, he had put his arm lightly round her waist the moment after speaking, beneath her hanging tail of hair. The younger dairymaids, including Tess, breakfasted with their hair loose on Sunday mornings before building it up extra high for attending church, a style which they could not adopt when milking with their heads against the cows. If she had said yes instead of no, he would have kissed her. It had evidently been his intention, but a determined negative deterred his scrupulous heart. Their condition of domiciliary comradeship put her, as the woman, to such disadvantage by its enforced intercourse that he felt it unfair to her to exercise any pressure of blandishment which he might have honestly employed had she been better able to avoid him. He released her momentarily imprisoned waist, and withheld the kiss. It all turned on that release. What had given her strength to refuse him this time was solely the tale of the widow told by the dairyman, and that would have been overcome in another moment. But Angel said no more. His face was perplexed. He went away. Day after day they met, somewhat less constantly than before, and thus 2 or 3 weeks went by. The end of September drew near, and she could see in his eye that he might ask her again. His plan of procedure was different now, as though he had made up his mind that her negatives were after all only coyness and youth, startled by the novelty of the proposal. The fitful evasiveness of her manner when the subject was under discussion countenanced the idea, so he played a more coaxing game, and while never going beyond words or attempting the renewal of caresses, he did his utmost orally. In this way Clare persistently wooed her in undertones like that of the purling milk, at the cow's side, at skimmings, at butter-makings, at cheese-makings, among broody poultry, and among farrowing pigs, as no milkmaid was ever wooed before by such a man. Tess knew that she must break down. Neither a religious sense of a certain moral validity in the previous union, nor a conscientious wish for candour could hold out against it much longer. She loved him so passionately, and he was so godly in her eyes, and being, though untrained, instinctively refined, her nature cried for his tutelary guidance. And thus, though Tess kept repeating to herself, "I can never be his wife," the words were in vain. A proof of her weakness lay in the very utterance of what calm strength would not have taken the trouble to formulate. Every sound of his voice, beginning on the cold subject, stirred her with a terrifying bliss, and she coveted the recantation she feared. His manner was, what man's is not, so much that of one who would love and cherish and defend her under any conditions, changes, charges, or revelations, that her gloom lessened as she basked in it. The season meanwhile was drawing onward to the equinox, and though it was still fine, the days were much shorter. The dairy had again worked by morning candlelight for a long time, and a fresh renewal of Clare's pleading occurred one morning between 3 and 4. She had run up in her bedgown to his door to call him as usual, then had gone back to dress and call the others, and in 10 minutes was walking to the head of the stairs with a candle in her hand. At the same moment he came down the steps from above in his shirt-sleeves, and put his arm across the stairway. "Now, Miss Flirt, before you go down," he said peremptorily, "it is a fortnight since I spoke, and this won't do any longer. You must tell me what you mean, or I shall have to leave this house. My door was ajar just now, and I saw you. For your own safety I must go." You don't know. Well, is it to be yes at last?" "I'm only just up, Mr. Clare, and it's too early to take me to task," she pouted. "You need not call me flirt. 'Tis cruel and untrue. Wait till by and by. Please wait till by and by. I will really think seriously about it between now and then. Let me go downstairs." She looked a little like what she said she was as, holding the candle sideways, she tried to smile away the seriousness of her words. "Call me Angel, then, and not Mr. Clare." "Angel." "Angel, dearest, why not?" "'Twould mean that I agree, wouldn't it?" "It would only mean that you love me, even if you cannot marry me, and you were so good as to own that long ago." "Very well, then. Angel, dearest, if I must," she murmured, looking at her candle, a roguish curl coming upon her mouth, notwithstanding her suspense. Clare had resolved never to kiss her until he had obtained her promise, but somehow, as Tess stood there in her pretty tucked-up milking gown, her hair carelessly heaped upon her head till there should be leisure to arrange it when skimming and milking were done, he broke his resolve and brought his lips to her cheek for one moment. She passed downstairs very quickly, never looking back at him or saying another word. The other maids were already down, and the subject was not pursued. Except Marian, they all looked wistfully and suspiciously at the pair in the sad yellow rays which the morning candles emitted in contrast with the first cold signals of the dawn without. When skimming was done, which, as the milk diminished with the approach of autumn, was a lessening process day by day, Retty and the rest went out. The lovers followed them. "Our tremulous lives are so different from theirs, are they not?" he musingly observed to her, as he regarded the three figures tripping before him through the frigid pallor of opening day. "Not so very different, I think," she said. "Why do you think that?" "There are very few women's lives that are not tremulous," Tess replied, pausing over the new word as if it impressed her. "There's more in those three than you think." "What is in them?" "Almost either of them," she began, perhaps would make a properer wife than I, and perhaps they love you as well as I, almost." "Oh, Tessie!" There were signs that it was almost an exquisite relief to her to hear the impatient exclamation, though she had resolved so intrepidly not to let generosity make one bid against herself. That was now done, and she had not the power to attempt self-immolation a second time then. They were joined by a milker from one of the cottages, and no more was said on that which concerned them so deeply. But Tess knew that this day would decide it. In the afternoon several of the dairyman's household and assistants went down to the meads as usual, a long way from the dairy, where many of the cows were milked without being driven home. The supply was getting less as the animals advanced in calf, and the supernumerary milkers of the lush green season had been dismissed. The work progressed leisurely. Each pailful was poured into tall cans that stood in a large spring waggon which had been brought upon the scene, and when they were milked the cows trailed away. Dairyman Crick, who was there with the rest, his wrapper gleaming miraculously white against the leaden evening sky, suddenly looked at his heavy watch. "Why, 'tis later than I thought," he said. "Begad, we shan't be soon enough with this milk at the station if we don't mind. There's no time to-day to take it home and mix it with the bulk afore sending off. It must go to station straight from here. Who'll drive it across?" Mr. Clare volunteered to do so, though it was none of his business, asking Tess to accompany him. The evening, though sunless, had been warm and muggy for the season, and Tess had come out with her milking hood only, naked-armed and jacketless, certainly not dressed for a drive. She therefore replied by glancing over her scant habiliments, but Clare gently urged her. She assented by relinquishing her pail and stool to the dairyman to take home, and mounted the spring waggon beside Clare. Chapter 29.
Tess of the d'Urbervilles by Thomas Hardy.
Chapter 30. In the diminishing daylight they went along the level roadway through the meads, which stretched away into grey miles, and were backed into the extreme edge of distance by the swarthy and abrupt slopes of Egdon Heath. On its summit stood clumps and stretches of fir trees, whose notched tips appeared like battlemented towers crowning black-fronted castles of enchantment. They were so absorbed in the sense of being close to each other that they did not begin talking for a long while, and the silence being broken only by the clucking of the milk in the tall cans behind them. The lane they followed was so solitary that the hazel-nuts had remained on the boughs till they slipped from their shells, and the blackberries hung in heavy clusters. Every now and then Angel would fling the lash of his whip round one of these, pluck it off, and give it to his companion. The dull sky soon began to tell its meaning by sending down herald drops of rain, and the stagnant air of the day changed into a fitful breeze which played about their faces. The quicksilvery glaze on the rivers and pools vanished. From broad mirrors of light they changed to lustreless sheets of lead, with a surface like a rasp. But that spectacle did not affect her preoccupation. Her countenance, a natural carnation slightly embrowned by the season, had deepened its tinge with the beating of the raindrops, and her hair, which the pressure of the cow's flanks had, as usual, caused to tumble down from its fastenings and stray beyond the curtain of her calico bonnet, was made clammy by the moisture, till it hardly was better than seaweed. "I ought not to have come, I suppose," she murmured, looking at the sky. "I'm sorry for the rain," said he, "but how glad I am to have you here." Remote Egdon disappeared by degrees behind the liquid gauze. The evening grew darker, and roads being crossed by gates, it was not safe to drive faster than at a walking pace. The air was rather chill. "I'm so afraid you will get cold with nothing upon your arms and shoulders," he said. "Creep close to me, and perhaps the drizzle won't hurt you much. I should be sorrier still if I did not think that the rain might be helping me." She imperceptibly crept closer, and he wrapped round them both a large piece of sailcloth, which was sometimes used to keep the sun off the milk cans. Tess held it from slipping off him as well as herself, Clare's hands being occupied. "Now we are all right again." "Oh no, we are not. It runs down into my neck a little, and it must still be more into yours. That's better. Your arms are like wet marble, Tess. Wipe them in the cloth. Now, if you want to stay quiet, you will not get another drop. Well, dear, about that question of mine, that long-standing question." The only reply that he could hear for a little while was the smack of the horses' hoofs on the moistening road, and the cluck of the milk in the cans behind them. "Do you remember what I said?" "I do," she replied. "Before we get home, mind." "I'll try." He said no more then. As they drove on, the fragment of an old manor house of Caroline date rose against the sky, and was in due course passed and left behind. "That," he observed, to entertain her, "is an interesting old place, one of the several seats which belong to an ancient Norman family formerly of great influence in this country, the d'Urbervilles. I never pass one of their residences without thinking of them. There's something very sad in the extinction of a family of renown, even if it was fierce, domineering, feudal renown. "Yes," said Tess. They crept along towards a point in the expanse of shade just at hand at which a feeble light was beginning to assert its presence, a spot where by day a fitful white streak of stream, at intervals beyond the dark green background, denoted intermittent moments of contact between their secluded world and modern life. Modern life stretched out its stream feeler to this point 3 or 4 times a day, touched their native existences, and quickly withdrew its feeler again, as if what it touched had been uncongenial. They reached the feeble light, which came from the smoky lamp of a little railway station, a poor enough terrestrial star, yet in one sense of more importance to Talbothays Dairy and mankind than the celestial ones to which it stood in such humiliating contrast. The cans of new milk were unladen in the rain, Tess getting a little shelter from a neighbouring holly tree. Then there was the hissing of a train, which drew up almost silently upon the wet rails, and the milk was rapidly swung, can by can, into the truck. The light of the engine flashed for a second upon Tess Durbeyfield's figure, motionless under the great holly tree. No object could have looked more foreign to the gleaming cranks and wheels than this unsophisticated girl, with the round bare arms, the rainy face and hair, the suspended attitude of a friendly leopard at pause, the print gown of no date or fashion, and the cotton bonnet drooping on her brow. She mounted again beside her lover, with a mute obedience characteristic of impassioned natures at times, and when they had wrapped themselves up over head and ears in the sailcloth again, they plunged back into the now thick night. Tess was so receptive that the few minutes of contact with the whirl of material progress lingered in her thought. "Londoners will drink it at their breakfast to-morrow, won't they?" she asked. "Strange people that we have never seen." "Yes, I suppose they will, though not as we send it, when its strength has been lowered, so that it might not get up into their heads." "Noble men and noble women, ambassadors and centurions, ladies and tradeswomen, and babies who have never seen a cow." "Well, yes, perhaps, particularly centurions." "Who don't know anything of us, and where it comes from, or think how we two drove miles across the moor to-night in the rain that it might reach them in time." "We did not drive entirely on account of these precious Londoners. We drove a little on our own, on account of that anxious matter which you will, I'm sure, set at rest, dear Tess. Now, permit me to put it in this way. You belong to me already, you know. Your heart, I mean, does it not?" "You know as well as I. Oh, yes, yes." "Then if your heart does, why not your hand?" "My only reason was on account of you, on account of a question. I have something to tell you." "But suppose it to be entirely for my happiness, and my worldly convenience also?" "Oh, yes, if it is for your happiness and worldly convenience. But my life before I came here, I want—" "Well, it is for my convenience as well as my happiness. If I have a very large farm, either English or colonial, you will be invaluable as a wife to me, better than a woman out of the largest mansion in the country. So please, please, dear Tessie, disabuse your mind of the feeling that you will stand in my way." "But my history, I want you to know it. You must let me tell you. You will not like me so well." "Tell it if you wish to, dearest. This precious history, then. Yes, I was born at so-and-so, Anno Domini." "I was born at Marlott," she said, catching at his words as a help, lightly as they were spoken. "And I grew up there, and I was in the 6th standard when I left school, and they said I had a great aptness and should make a good teacher, so it was settled that I should be one. But there was trouble in my family. Father was not very industrious, and he drank a little." "Yes, yes, poor child. nothing new." He pressed her more closely to his side. "And then there is something very unusual about it, about me. I was—" Tess's breath quickened. "Yes, dearest, never mind." I am not a Durbeyfield, but a d'Urberville, a descendant of the same family as those that occupied the old house we passed, and we are all gone to nothing." "A d'Urberville, indeed! And is that all the trouble, dear Tess?" "Yes," she answered faintly. "Well, why should I love you less after knowing this?" "I was told by the dairyman that you hated old families." "Well, it is true in one sense. I do hate the aristocratic principle of blood before everything, and do think that as reasoners the only pedigrees we ought to respect are those spiritual ones of the wise and virtuous, without regard to corporeal paternity. But I am extremely interested in this news. You can have no idea how interested I am. Are you not interested yourself in being one of that well-known line?" "No. I've thought it sad, especially since coming here and knowing that many of the hills and fields I see once belonged to my father's people. But other hills and fields belong to Retty's people, and perhaps others to Marian's, so that I don't value it particularly." "Yes, it is surprising how many of the present tillers of the soil were once owners of it, and I sometimes wonder that a certain school of politicians don't make a capital out of the circumstance, but they don't seem to know it. I wonder that I did not see the resemblance of your name to d'Urberville and trace the manifest corruption. And this was the carking secret." She had not told. At the last moment her courage had failed her. She feared his blame for not telling him sooner. Her instinct of self-preservation was stronger than her candour. "Of course," continued the unwitting Clare, "I should have been glad to know you to be descended exclusively from the long-suffering, dumb, unrecorded rank and file of the English nation, and not from the self-seeking few who have made themselves powerful at the expense of the rest. But I'm corrupted away from that by my affection for you, Tess," he laughed as he spoke, "and made selfish likewise. For your own sake I rejoice in your descent. Society is hopelessly snobbish, and this fact of your extraction may make an appreciable difference to its acceptance of you as my wife, after I have made you the well-read woman that I mean to make you. My mother, too, poor soul, will think so much better of you on account of it. Tess, you must spell your name correctly, d'Urberville, from this very day." "I like the other way rather best." "But you must, dearest. Good heavens! Why, dozens of mushroom millionaires would jump at such a possession. By the by, there's one of that kidney who has taken the name. Where have I heard of him? Up in the neighbourhood of the Chase, I think. Why, he is the very man who had that rumpus with my father I told you of. What an odd coincidence!" "Angel, I think I would rather not take the name. It is unlucky, perhaps." She was agitated. "Now then, Mistress Teresa d'Urberville, I have you. Take my name, and so you will escape yours. The secret is out, so why should you any longer refuse me?" "If it is sure to make you happy to have me as your wife, and you feel that you do wish to marry me very, very much—" "I do, dearest, of course." "I mean that it is only your wanting me very much, and being hardly able to keep alive without me, whatever my offence is, that would make me feel I ought to say I will." "You will. You do say it, I know. You will be mine for ever and ever." He clasped her close and kissed her. "Yes." She had no sooner said it than she burst into a dry, hard sobbing, so violent that it seemed to rend her. Tess was not a hysterical girl by any means, and he was surprised. "Why do you cry, dearest?" "I can't tell quite. I'm so glad to think of being yours and making you happy." "But this does not seem very much like gladness, my Tessie." "I mean, I cry because I've broken down in my vow. I said I would die unmarried." "But if you love me, you would like me to be your husband?" "Yes, yes, yes. But oh, I sometimes wish I had never been born." "Now, my dear Tess, if I did not know that you are very much excited and very inexperienced, I should say that remark was not very complimentary. How came you to wish that if you care for me? Do you care for me? I wish you would prove it in some way." "How can I prove it more than I have done?" she cried in a distraction of tenderness. "Will this prove it more?" She clasped his neck, and for the first time Clare learned what an impassioned woman's kisses were like upon the lips of one whom she loved with all her heart and soul, as Tess loved him. "There, now do you believe?" she asked, flushed and wiping her eyes. "Yes, I never really doubted. Never, never." So they drove on through the gloom, forming one bundle inside the sailcloth, the horse going as he would, and the rain driving against them. She had consented. She might as well have agreed at first. The appetite for joy which pervades all creation, that tremendous force which sways humanity to its purpose as the tide sways the helpless weed, was not to be controlled by vague lucubrations over the social rubric. "I must write to my mother," she said. "You don't mind my doing that?" "Of course not, dear child. You are a child to me, Tess, not to know how very proper it is to write to your mother at such a time, and how wrong it would be in me to object. Where does she live?" "In the same place, Marlott, on the further side of Blackmoor Vale." "Ah, then I have seen you before this summer." "Yes, at that dance on the green, but you would not dance with me. Oh, I hope that is not of ill omen for us now." End of chapter 30.
Tess of the d'Urbervilles by Thomas Hardy.
Chapter 31. Tess wrote a most touching and urgent letter to her mother the very next day, and by the end of the week a response to her communication arrived in Joan Durbeyfield's wandering last-century hand. "Dear Tess, I write these few lines hoping they will find you well as they leave me at present, thank God for it. Dear Tess, we are all glad to hear that you are going really to be married soon, but with respect to your question, Tess, I say between ourselves, quite private but very strong, that on no account do you say a word of your bygone trouble to him. I did not tell everything to your father, he being so proud on account of his respectability, which perhaps your intended is the same. Many a woman, some of the highest in the land, have had a trouble in their time, and why should you trumpet yours when others don't trumpet theirs? No girl would be such a fool, especially as it is a long time ago, and not your fault at all. I shall answer the same if you ask me 50 times. Besides, you must bear in mind that, knowing it to be your childish nature to tell all that's in your heart, so simple, I made you promise me never to let it out by word or deed, having your welfare in mind, and you most solemnly did promise it going from this door. I have not named either that question or your coming marriage to your father, as he would blab it everywhere, poor simple man. Dear Tess, keep up your spirits, and we mean to send you a hogshead of cider for your wedding, knowing there is not much in your parts, and thin sour stuff there is. So no more at present, and with kind love to your young man, from your affectionate mother, J. Durbeyfield." "Oh, mother, mother," murmured Tess. She was recognizing how light was the touch of events, the most oppressive upon Mrs. Durbeyfield's elastic spirit. Her mother did not see life as Tess saw it. That haunting episode of bygone days was to her mother but a passing accident. But perhaps her mother was right as to the course to be followed, whatever she might be in her reasons. Silence seemed, on the face of it, best for her adored one's happiness. Silence it should be. Thus, steadied by a command from the only person in the world who had any shadow of right to control her action, Tess grew calmer. The responsibility was shifted, and her heart was lighter than it had been for weeks. The day of declining autumn which followed her ascent, beginning with the month of October, formed a season through which she lived in spiritual attitudes more nearly approaching ecstasy than any other period of her life. There was hardly a touch of earth in her love for Clare. To her sublime trustfulness he was all that goodness could be, knew all that a guide, philosopher and friend should know. She thought every line in the contour of his person the perfection of masculine beauty, his soul the soul of a saint, his intellect that of a seer. The wisdom of her love for him as love sustained her dignity. She seemed to be wearing a crown. The compassion of his love for her as she saw it made her lift up her heart to him in devotion. He would sometimes catch her large worshipful eyes, that had no bottom to them, looking at him from their depths, as if she saw something immortal before her. She dismissed the past, trod upon it, and put it out, as one treads upon a coal that is smouldering and dangerous. She had not known that men could be so disinterested, chivalrous, protective in their love for women as he. Angel Clare was far from all that she thought him in this respect, absurdly far indeed, but he was in truth more spiritual than animal. He had himself well in hand, and was singularly free from grossness. Though not cold-natured, he was rather bright than hot, less Byronic than Shelleyan, could love desperately, but with a love more especially inclined to the imaginative and ethereal. It was a fastidious emotion, which could jealously guard the loved one against his very self. This amazed and enraptured Tess, whose slight experiences had been so infelicitous till now, and in her reaction from indignation against the male sex she swerved to excess of honour for Clare. They unaffectedly sought each other's company. In her honest faith she did not disguise her desire to be with him. The sum of her instincts in this matter, if clearly stated, would have been that the elusive quality in her sex which attracts men in general might be distasteful to so perfect a man after an avowal of love, since it must in its very nature carry with it a suspicion of art. The country custom of unreserved comradeship out of doors during betrothal was the only custom she knew, and to her it had no strangeness, though it seemed oddly anticipative to Clare till he saw how normal a thing she, in common with all the other dairy folk, regarded it. Thus, during this October month of wonderful afternoons, they roved along the meads by creeping paths which followed the brinks of trickling tributary brooks, hopping across by little wooden bridges to the other side and back again. They were never out of the sound of some purling weir, whose bars accompanied their own murmuring, while the beams of the sun, almost as horizontal as the mead itself, formed a pollen of radiance over the landscape. They saw tiny blue fogs in the shadows of trees and hedges, all the time that there was bright sunshine elsewhere. The sun was so near the ground, and the sward so flat, that the shadows of Clare and Tess would stretch a quarter of a mile ahead of them, like two long fingers pointing afar to where the green alluvial reaches abutted against the sloping sides of the vale. Men were at work here and there, for it was the season for taking up the meadows or digging the little waterways clear for the winter irrigation, and mending their banks where trodden down by the cows. The shovelfuls of loam, black as jet, brought there by the river when it was as wide as the whole valley, were an essence of soils, pounded champagnes of the past, steeped, refined, and subtilized to extraordinary richness, out of which came all the fertility of the mead and of the cattle grazing there. Clare hardily kept his arm round her waist in sight of these watermen, with the air of a man who was accustomed to public dalliance, though actually as shy as she, who, with lips parted and eyes askance on the labourers, wore the look of a wary animal the while. "You are not ashamed of owning me as yours before them," she said gladly. "Oh, no." "But if it should reach the ears of your friends at Erminster that you were walking about like this with me, a milkmaid, the most bewitching milkmaid ever seen, they might feel it a hurt to their dignity." "My dear girl, a d'Urberville hurt the dignity of a Clare? It is a grand card to play, that of your belonging to such a family, and I am reserving it for a grand effect when we are married, and have the proofs of your descent from Parson Tringham. Apart from that, my future is to be totally foreign to my family. It will not affect even the surface of their lives. We shall leave this part of England, perhaps England itself, and what does it matter how people regard us here? You will like going, will you not?" She could answer no more than a bare affirmative, so great was the emotion aroused in her at the thought of going through the world with him as her own familiar friend. Her feelings almost filled her ears like a babble of waves, and surged up to her eyes. She put her hand in his, and thus they went on to a place where the reflected sun glared up from the river under a bridge with a molten metallic glow that dazzled their eyes, though the sun itself was hidden by the bridge. They stood still, whereupon little furred and feathered heads popped up from the smooth surface of the water, but finding that the disturbing presences had paused and not passed by, they disappeared again. Upon this river brink they lingered till the fog began to close round them, which was very early in the evening at this time of the year, settling on the lashes of her eyes, where it rested like crystals, and on his brows and hair. They walked later on Sundays, when it was quite dark. Some of the dairy people, who were also out of doors on the first Sunday evening after their engagement, heard her impulsive speeches ecstaticized to fragments, though they were too far off to hear the words discoursed, noted the spasmodic catch in her remarks, broken into syllables by the leapings of her heart as she walked leaning on his arm, her contented pauses, the occasional little laugh upon which her soul seemed to ride, the laugh of a woman in company with the man she loves, and as one from all other women, unlike anything else in nature. They marked the buoyancy of her tread, like the skim of a bird which has not quite alighted. Her affection for him was now the breath and life of Tess's being. It enveloped her as a photosphere, irradiated her into forgetfulness of her past sorrows, keeping back the gloomy spectres that would persist in their attempts to touch her: doubt, fear, moodiness, care, shame. She knew that they were waiting like wolves just outside the circumscribing light, but she had long spells of power to keep them in hungry subjection there. A spiritual forgetfulness coexisted with an intellectual remembrance. She walked in brightness, but she knew that in the background those shapes of darkness were always spread. They might be receding, or they might be approaching, one or the other, a little every day. One evening Tess and Clare were obliged to sit indoors keeping house, all the other occupants of the domicile being away. As they talked she looked thoughtfully up at him, and met his two appreciative eyes. "I am not worthy of you, no, I am not," she burst out, jumping up from her low stool as though appalled at his homage and the fulness of her own joy thereat. Clare, deeming the whole basis of her excitement to be that which was only the smaller part of it, said, "I won't have you speak like it, dear Tess. Distinction does not consist in the facile use of a contemptible set of conventions, but in being numbered among those who are true and honest and just and pure and lovely and of good report, as you are, my Tess." She struggled with the sob in her throat. How often had that string of excellencies made her young heart ache in church of late years, and how strange that he should have cited them now. "Why didn't you stay and love me when I was 16, living with my little sisters and brothers, and you danced on the green? Oh, why didn't you? Why didn't you?" she said impetuously, clasping her hands. Angel began to comfort and reassure her, thinking to himself truly enough what a creature of moods she was, and how careful he would have to be of her when she depended for her happiness entirely upon him. "Ah, why didn't I stay?" he said. "That is just what I feel. If I had only known. But you must not be so bitter in your regard. Why should you be?" With the woman's instinct to hide, she diverged hastily. "I should have had 4 more years of your heart than I can ever have now. Then I should not have wasted my time as I have done. I should have had so much longer happiness." It was no mature woman with a dark vista of intrigue behind her who was tormented thus, but a girl of simple life, not yet 21, who had been caught during her days of immaturity like a bird in a springe. To calm herself the more completely, she rose from her little stool and left the room, overturning the stool with her skirts as she went. He sat on by the cheerful firelight thrown from a bundle of green ash sticks laid across the dogs. The sticks snapped pleasantly, and hissed out bubbles of sap from their ends. When she came back she was herself again. "Do you not think you are just a wee bit capricious, fitful, Tess?" he said good-humouredly, as he spread a cushion for her on the stool, and seated himself in the settle beside her. "I wanted to ask you something, and just then you ran away." "Yes, perhaps I am capricious," she murmured. She suddenly approached him, and put a hand upon each of his arms. "No, Angel, I am not really so, by nature I mean." The more particularly to assure him that she was not, she placed herself close to him on the settle, and allowed her head to find a resting place against Clare's shoulder. "What did you want to ask me? I am sure I will answer it," she continued humbly. "Well, you love me, and have agreed to marry me, and hence there follows a thirdly. When shall the day be?" "I like living like this." "But I must think of starting in business on my own hook with the new year, or a little later, and before I get involved in the multifarious details of my new position I should like to have secured my partner." "But," she timidly answered, "to talk quite practically, wouldn't it be best not to marry till after all that? Though I can't bear the thought of your going away and leaving me here." "Of course you cannot, and it is not best in this case. I want you to help me in many ways in making my start. When shall it be? Why not a fortnight from now?" "No," she said, becoming grave. "I have so many things to think of first." "But—" he drew her gently near to him. The reality of marriage was startling when it loomed so near. Before discussion of the question had proceeded further, there walked around the corner of the settle into the full firelight of the apartment Mr. Dairyman Crick, Mrs. Crick, and 2 of the milkmaids. Tess sprang like an elastic ball from his side to her feet, while her face flushed and her eyes shone in the firelight. "I knew how it would be if I sat so close to him," she cried with vexation. "I said to myself, they are sure to come and catch us, and I wasn't really sitting on his knee, though it might have seemed as if I was almost."
"Well, if so, be you hadn't told us, I'm sure we shouldn't have noticed that ye had been sitting anywhere at all in this light," replied the dairyman. He continued to his wife with the solid mien of a man who understood nothing of the emotions related to matrimony. "Now, Christianer, that shows that folks should never fancy other folks be supposing things when they bain't. Oh no, I should never have thought a word of where she was a-sitting to if she hadn't told me, not I." "We're going to be married soon," said Clare with improvised phlegm. "Ah, and be ye? Well, I'm truly glad to hear it, sir. I thought you mid do such a thing for some time. She's too good for a dairymaid. I said so the very first day I zid her, and a prize for any man, and what's more, a wonderful woman for a gentleman farmer's wife. He won't be at the mercy of his baily with her at his side."
Somehow Tess disappeared. She had been even more struck with the look of the girls who followed Crick than abashed by Crick's blunt praise. After supper, when she reached her bedroom, they were all present. A light was burning, and each damsel was sitting up whitely in her bed, awaiting Tess, the whole like a row of avenging ghosts. But she saw in a few moments that there was no malice in their mood. They could scarcely feel as a loss what they had never expected to have. Their condition was objective, contemplative. "He's going to marry her," murmured Retty, never taking her eyes off Tess. "How her face do show it!" "You be going to marry him?" asked Marian. "Yes," said Tess.
"When?"
"Some day." They thought this was evasiveness only. "Yes, going to marry him, a gentleman," repeated Izz Huett, and by a sort of fascination the 3 girls, one after another, crept out of their beds and came and stood barefooted around Tess. Retty put her hands upon Tess's shoulders, as if to realise her friend's corporality after such a miracle, and the other 2 laid their arms around her waist, all looking into her face. "How it do seem, almost more than I can think of," said Izz Huett. Marian kissed Tess. "Yes," she murmured as she withdrew her lips. "Was that because of love of her, or because all the lips have touched there by now?" continued Izz dryly to Marian. "I wasn't thinking of that," said Marian simply. "I was only feeling all the strangeness on't, that she is to be his wife, and nobody else. I don't say nay to it, nor either of us, because we did not think of it, only loved him. Still, nobody else is to marrying in the world, no fine lady, nobody in silks and satins, but she who do live like we." "Are you sure you don't dislike me for it?" said Tess in a low voice. They hung about her in their white nightgowns before replying, as if they considered their answer might lie in her look. I don't know," murmured Retty Priddle. "I want to hate 'ee, but I cannot." "That's how I feel," echoed Izz and Marian. "I can't hate her. Somehow she hinders me." "He ought to marry one of you," murmured Tess. "Why?" "You are all better than I." "We better than you?" said the girls in a low, slow whisper.
"No, no, dear Tess."
"You are," she contradicted impetuously, and suddenly tearing away from their clinging arms, she burst into a hysterical fit of tears, bowing herself on the chest of drawers, and repeating incessantly, "Oh yes, yes, yes." Having once given way, she could not stop her weeping. "He ought to have had one of you," she cried. "I think I ought to make him even now. You would be better for him than... I don't know what I'm saying. Oh, oh!" They went up to her and clasped her round, but still her sobs tore her.
"Get some water," said Marian. "She's upset by us, poor thing, poor thing."
They gently led her back to the side of her bed, where they kissed her warmly.
"You are best for'n," said Marian. "More ladylike and a better scholar than we, especially since he has taught 'ee so much. But even you ought to be proud. You be proud, I'm sure."
"Yes, I am," she said, "and I am ashamed at so breaking down." When they were all in bed and the light out, Marian whispered across to her, "You will think of us when you be his wife, Tess, and how we told 'ee that we loved him, and how we tried not to hate you, and did not hate you, and could not hate you, because you were his choice, and we never hoped to be chose by him." They were not aware that, at these words, salt stinging tears trickled down upon Tess's pillow anew, and how she resolved with a bursting heart to tell all her history to Angel Clare, despite her mother's command, to let him for whom she lived and breathed despise her if he would, and her mother regard her as a fool, rather than preserve a silence which might be deemed a treachery to him, and which somehow seemed a wrong to these. Chapter 31